The fact that Japan took part in World War II as an ally of Hitler's Germany is well known to everyone. But what about the First World War, which contemporaries and historians often called the Great European War? How does this relate to the land of the rising sun? Why did it come into conflict with the German Empire, and even with Austria-Hungary? And how did it all end for it? You will find out in the video. Hello, everyone. My name is Vladlen Mariev, and you are watching History Without Myths, where we talk about the past of Ukraine and the world without embellishment or falsification. Subscribe to our channel and click on the bell so you don't miss new videos. Let Ukrainian language YouTube flourish. The topic of this video was chosen by our Patreon backers. 61% voted for the option, Japan in the First World War. Japan approached the First World War as one of the most powerful maritime powers in the world, a young colonial empire thirsty for conquest. Victories in the wars against China and the Russian Empire brought Japan to these heights, but only fueled the aspirations of the political leadership. In 1910, Korea finally joined, and now the rulers in Tokyo were most interested in expanding their sphere of influence in neighboring China. Internal instability in this country gave them confidence. In 1912, the Xinhai Revolution took place there, overthrowing the Qing Empire and leading to the proclamation of the Republic of China. However, the fierce internal struggle continued. In the same year, Emperor Meiji, who was a symbol of the country's modernization and westernization, died in Japan. His son Yoshihito took his place. The motto of his reign was Great Justice, but the new monarch had long suffered from neurological diseases and was less and less involved in public affairs every year. Power was concentrated in the hands of the Genro, a group of unofficial but very influential imperial elders, and the prime minister, who in April of 1914 became Akuma Shigenobu. He was an ardent supporter of the most active aggressive policy of conquest. In the foreign arena, Japan's main ally was Great Britain, with whom 3 agreements were concluded at the beginning of the century. However, it was becoming increasingly clear that the Japanese and British were competing for dominance in China. Tokyo's rulers were looking for other partners and for some time were at a crossroads which side to take: the Entente or the Triple Alliance. The fact is that since the Meiji Revolution of 1867 and 68, Japan has maintained close contacts with Germany. German advisors helped modernize the country. The Japanese army was being rebuilt according to the Prussian model, and German capital was widely represented in the economy. But the Second Reich, under the leadership of Wilhelm II Hohenzollern, was also a young empire hungry for colonial conquests, and it also had its own intentions for China. In 1898, the Germans used the brutal murder of their Catholic missionaries by unknown persons as a pretext to force China to lease the territory of Jiaozhou for 99 years. Although small in area, at 552 square kilometers, much smaller than modern Kyiv, this territory contained the important port of Tsingtao on the Yellow Sea, where the Germans immediately stationed their East Asian cruiser squadron. The Jiaozhou concession was only legally part of China, although in reality all power belonged to the Germans. They actively developed coal mines, built schools, a railroad, water supply and sewerage systems, and electricity. Thanks to them, there was even a brewery that produced different types of beer. The Japanese turned their attention to this concession. They acted on purely pragmatic grounds. The British colonies were better protected, the German fleet was weaker than the British, and the port of Jiaozhou was also located relatively close to the already annexed Korea on the other side of the Yellow Sea. When the war in Europe broke out on July 28, 1914, Japan initially stayed out of the picture. On August 4, Japan even declared neutrality, but this did not last long. On August 8, an emergency government meeting was held, at which Foreign Minister Kato Takaaki said the following. As of today, Japan has no grounds to enter the war in accordance with its obligations under the British-Japanese Alliance Treaty. According to the terms of the treaty, the situation requiring Japan's immediate entry into the war had not yet arisen. However, I am convinced that going to war for the sake of the benefit of strengthening the empire's international political position by eradicating the pillar of German influence in the East is the best political decision in line with the current political moment. On the same day, the government made the fateful decision to join the Entente. On August 15, Kato Takaaki sent an ultimatum to Foreign Minister Gottlieb von Jagow through the Japanese diplomatic mission in Berlin. The content of the ultimatum was as follows. First, all German warships must immediately leave all neighboring territorial waters of Japan and China. Those ships that could not leave were to be disarmed. Second, the German government should hand over the entire leased territory of Jiaozhou to the Japanese authorities without any conditions or compensation by September 16, 1914, in order to return it to China. This is how the Japanese tried to disguise their aggression, as if they were altruistic and were simply going to return the German concession to the full control of the Chinese government. The ultimatum was to expire in 8 days. The Germans were extremely irritated by this insolence and decided not to respond at all. Instead, German propaganda spread pictures like Deutschland's Antwort of a brave Kaiser soldier kicking a weak Japanese soldier's ass. Similar drawings had already been made in the Russian Empire a decade earlier, but no one could have guessed how it would end. When the ultimatum expired, on August 23, Japan declared war on Germany, and 2 days later on Austria-Hungary. Japan took advantage of the fact that the Habsburg Empire did not withdraw its armored cruiser Kaiser and Elizabeth from the port of Tsingtao. On August 27, the Japanese fleet began a blockade of the German concession of Jiaozhou. For these actions, the Japanese command engaged the Second Fleet under the command of Vice Admiral Kato Sadakichi. He had up to 40 warships and more than 50 transports for the transportation of troops, weapons, and ammunition. Lieutenant General Kamio Mitsuomi led the ground force, which numbered up to 60,000 personnel. The British Allies provided symbolic support. 1,500 soldiers under the command of Nathaniel Barnardiston, a veteran of the Boer War, set out from the Tianjin concession. The Germans could oppose them with very modest forces. They did not repeat the catastrophic experience of the Russians, who in 1904 left their 1st Pacific Squadron to die in Japanese blockaded Port Arthur. On the contrary, they prudently withdrew the main forces of their East Asian cruiser squadron. They began to prowl the waters of the Pacific, Indian, and Atlantic Oceans, sinking enemy transports and merchant ships, and shelling ports in the British colonies. But in the end, almost all of them were killed in a battle near the Falkland Islands on December 8, 1914. Qingdao has only 2 to 3 light or outdated cruisers, 4 to 5 gunboats, and 1 destroyer. The garrison consisted of up to 5,000 soldiers under the general command of the governor, Captain First Rank Alfred Meyer Waldeck. Interestingly, among the defenders were units of the local Chinese colonial police, about 100 people in total. Although officially China remained neutral until August 1917. Two German Rumpler Taube aircraft were in service, but only one of them was in airworthy condition. pilot Gunther Plushow flew reconnaissance and bombing missions in the plane, and once met a Japanese aircraft in the air and fired at it from the parabellum. Plyushov even claimed that he had run over his counterpart, but this information was not reliably confirmed. The Japanese also made the most of the experience of the siege of Port Arthur, which we described in detail in a separate video. They relied on artillery. Within a few weeks, they managed to concentrate 96 heavy guns and another 50 field and mountain guns, which began to methodically destroy enemy fortifications. Nevertheless, the Germans managed to hold out in very unfavorable conditions for more than 2 months. During the siege of Tsingtao, the first case in history was recorded when ship-based aircraft attacked an enemy ship. On September 6, 1914, a French-made Japanese Farman aircraft from the Wakamiya hydroplane dropped bombs on the already mentioned Austro-Hungarian cruiser Kaiserin Elizabeth, but none of them hit the target. On the German side, we note the success of the C-90 destroyer under the command of Lieutenant Commander Paul Brunner. On the night before October 18, he made a breakthrough from the blockaded port of Tsingtao, when an old armored cruiser Takachio, a veteran of the Sino-Japanese and Russo-Japanese wars, suddenly appeared on his way. The Germans fired 3 torpedoes, 2 of which hit the Takachio. This caused the detonation of the ammunition and the ship was literally torn into 2 parts, which rapidly sank. 264 sailors were killed, and according to other sources, even more 271, including the commander Ito Tsukisu. The night was dark and the water was cold, so no more than 12 people survived. These were Japan's largest single losses in the entire First World War. As for the German destroyer, it washed ashore 60 miles from Tsingtao, either after running out of coal or running into reefs. The crew was interned by the Chinese. On October 31, the Japanese launched a massive artillery attack on Tsingtao fortifications that lasted for a week. Due to serious damage and the exhaustion of ammunition, the German garrison surrendered on the morning of November 7. The day before, Gunther Plushow took off from the doomed fortress in his Taube with secret documents. He landed on neutral Chinese territory and then burned the plane. A year later, Plyushchev managed to return to Germany. After the surrender of Tsingtao, about 4,700 German and Austro-Hungarian soldiers were taken prisoner. They were taken to camps in Japan, where they were kept in decent conditions for more than 5 years. Japanese historian Seto Takahiko, an honorary professor at the University of Kochi, recalls a single case of violence. On November 15, 1915, in the Kurume camp in Fukuoka Prefecture, the camp commander, Masaki Jinzaburo, beat the captured officers. On the occasion of Emperor Taisho's accession to the throne, the prisoners were given a bottle of beer and 2 apples, but 2 officers refused to accept the gift, saying that their country was at war with Japan. Enraged, Masaki beat them. Since the Hague Convention prohibited cruel treatment of prisoners of war, and they were extremely outraged by Masaki's actions, things got to the point where the prisoners demanded a meeting with a representative of the American embassy. At that time, America had not yet entered the war. Masaki was dismissed from his position as camp commander. The prisoners were released home in the late 1920s and early 20s, but 170 of them decided to stay in Japan. At home, they were all considered real heroes, and former Governor Meyer Waldeck was promoted in absentia by 2 ranks to vice admiral. The German Minister of the Navy, Grand Admiral Alfred von Terpitz, reflecting on the feasibility of hopeless defense of Tsingtao, said the following: "If we had given up Tsingtao without a fight, we would have lost it anyway, but the alliance with Japan that we should have sought was only possible if we saved our honor in East Asia." An unconditional surrender would have a depressing effect on the state of the national spirit in the struggle for existence. In addition, in August 1914, no one could predict how long the war would last. The army's victorious march was still going on, and the army was full of confidence in the future. It was necessary to consider the possibility of holding Tsingtao until the end of the war, which could be close. The capture of Jiaozhou was the largest Japanese operation in World War I. During September and October of 1914, the Japanese squadron of Vice Admiral Yamaya Tannen also captured the German colonies in the Pacific, the Mariana, Caroline, and Marshall Islands. There was no resistance anywhere, and near the island of Yap German sailors, having spotted enemy ships, sunk their hydrographic vessel Planet. After the war, the League of Nations officially handed over to Japan the mandate to govern these islands, which formally remained in force until 1943. In February of 1915, the Japanese armored cruisers Ottawa and Tsushima helped the British suppress an uprising of 850 Sipai soldiers in Singapore. Interestingly, 27 years later, during World War II, Japanese troops would defeat the British and take Singapore, which would become one of the heaviest defeats in the history of Foggy Albion. When the fighting in Europe turned into a protracted war, the Entente countries began to put pressure on Japan to send its ground forces to help them. Such requests were made by Britain, France, Russia, Belgium, and even Serbia. However, the rulers in Tokyo categorically refused. The only thing they agreed to, and that was only in 1917, was to send a small squadron to the Mediterranean. On June 11, the squadron destroyer Sakari was torpedoed by the Austro-Hungarian submarine U-27. At least 59 crew members were killed, including the commander, Taichi Uehara. However, the heavily damaged ship managed to make it to the Greek port of Piraeus. In honor of the victims, a memorial was erected at the Kalkara Naval Cemetery on the island of Malta. Some Japanese volunteers went to war in Europe. Among them was Shigeno Kiyotake, who enlisted in the French Foreign Legion, became a military pilot, and won 2-8 air victories on the Western Front, which is why he is sometimes called the first ace in Japanese history. Shigeno was made a Chevalier of the Legion of Honor. He even found love in this country, marrying 22-year-old Jean Imar, with whom he had 3 children. The refusal to send troops to Europe was explained by the fact that Japan was primarily seeking to increase its influence in China, possibly even by going to war with that country. On January 18, 1915, Prime Minister Akuma Shigenobu made 21 demands of the Chinese government. For example, to recognize all future Japanese-German territorial agreements. In this way, they wanted to legitimize the seizure of the Jiaozhou concession. Next, to provide Japan with new bases on its territory, railroads and mineral deposits, and to refuse to lease harbors, bays and islands along the Chinese coast to other countries. But the following demands were particularly humiliating. The Chinese central government engages influential Japanese as political, financial, and military advisors. The Chinese government grants Japanese hospitals, temples, and schools in the interior of China the right to own land. Police in China, where necessary, are placed under joint Japanese and Chinese administration, or Japanese are employed in police departments to help improve the Chinese police service. The Chinese government grants Japanese citizens the right to preach in their country. It is clear that these demands contained encroachments on China's state sovereignty. Therefore, the leaders in Beijing agreed to fulfill them only partially. At the same time, they deteriorated Japan's relations with Britain, France, and the United States, where they believed that the Japanese were rushing events in China too much and began to threaten their influence. The authorities in London, Paris, and Washington perceived such actions by the Japanese at a time when Europe was bleeding to death as something akin to burglary. Dissatisfaction with the Allies was growing in Tokyo as well. For example, in 1916, the Minister of the Interior, Goto Shimpei, published a pamphlet entitled, My Opinion on the Current Political Situation, in which he stated the following. The words that the foundation of the British-Japanese alliance is becoming stronger and relations with allied countries are becoming closer remain just a convenient diplomatic formula that has no real evidence. Here and there, states demonstrate their anti-Japanese sentiments. In London, Paris, and New York, our country has a bad reputation. On the one hand, they openly praise Japan's actions as an ally, but on the other hand, they cannot hide their contempt and indignation at their yellow friend, who dared to intervene in the war of European powers. Against this backdrop, Japan's rapprochement with the Russian Empire was marked. Since the end of 1914, the Russians have been massively purchasing weapons and equipment from their recent enemy, including 820,000 rifles and carbines, and over 1,100 cannons. The Japanese even managed to sell the Varyug cruiser to the Russians. Yes, this is the same Varyug that they sunk in 1904 in Shimolpo, and then raised, repaired, and included in their fleet under the name Soya. At the beginning of 1916, Grand Duke Georgy Mikhailovich, the Tsar's great-uncle, paid an official visit to Tokyo. And on July 3, 1916, in the Russian capital, the two empires signed an alliance treaty aimed at preventing China from being dominated by any other country. However, this agreement could not be implemented due to the outbreak of the Russian Revolution. As early as April 1918, Japanese troops began to land in Vladivostok and gradually take control of Primory, the Amur region, and Transbaikalia. But this is a separate topic about the participation of the Japanese in the Russian Civil War, so we will cover it in a separate video if this video gets 20,000 likes in a month. The Japanese Empire emerged victorious from World War I, suffering minimal losses, and achieved a rapid economic recovery. Military supplies to European allies made it possible to double the production of steel and pig iron and double the capacity of power plants. The value of Japanese engineering and chemical products has increased sevenfold in 5 years. However, after the war, the Allies, alarmed by Japan's rise, partially isolated it internationally. Japan's intentions were dealt a severe blow at a Washington International Conference held from November 1921 to February 1922. First, the British-Japanese military-political alliance was effectively liquidated. Secondly, the maximum tonnage of battleships and aircraft carriers of the United States, Britain, and Japan was set at a ratio of 5:3. This meant that the Japanese Navy had to remain much weaker than the American and British navies. Finally, thirdly, the Land of the Rising Sun was forced to withdraw from most of the captured territories of China, including the Jiaozhou concession, which was seized from the Germans in 1914. The combination of these factors was one of the main reasons for the further alienation of the Japanese Empire from Western democracies. Eventually, this led to attempts to break the Versailles-Washington system of international relations and to Japan's participation in World War II as an ally of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. Dear viewers, don't forget to subscribe to our History Without Myths channel, click the bell and write a comment below the video. Thank you for watching. Glory to Ukraine!